Alright, so I've been wanting to make some video tutorials for ShipBucket for quite a while now. The first one that I'm going to try to knock out for you guys is how I do camouflage. Several people have asked me for this over the last couple of weeks, and I think it might be easier to just show it to you in real time versus making an article on the side of the forum. So let's just jump right into it. The ship that I'm going to be using for this is the Frank Knox. This is one of the Gearing class destroyers that I just completed a few days ago. I'm going to be trying to recreate its Measure 33 scheme. This is one of the Dazzle schemes that was used in 1944 prior to the shift over to Measure 21 and Measure 22. So obviously I've got Photoshop open. Just to give you an idea about how I make these drawings. I've got all my different components on layers here. This is what this panel is in the bottom right corner. And most importantly, I've got the railing and the rigging separated, which will come in handy later on, but I'll get to that in just a second. What I've done here is to create a new layer, a new folder for my camouflage layers, and I've brought in my kind of abbreviated color palette that I use for making the camouflage schemes. So just to give you an idea of how I do this. I first create the drawing using the standard ShipBucket gray. This is the uniform gray color that we use for every drawing. Then once it's done and finalized, I create a new layer on top of that in one of these folders that I then use for creating the camouflage as kind of an overlay. And I'll show you how I do all of this momentarily. So I've got my abbreviated palette here. What I'm going to be doing for this is the first thing I'm going to do is create the base layer, which I'll do with the 5L light gray. So let me first bring over the camouflage design sheet. This is my little folder that I've created with some references. So this is the design sheet for the Measure 33A Design 28 scheme that I've gotten from the usndazzle.com website, which has all of the different patterns, all the different Dazzle patterns available for free. So what's important about this is the different colors that they use. So for this, I'm only using 3 colors, which is really helpful. I'm using light gray 5L, ocean gray 5O, and deck blue 20B. The main colors that I'm going to be using are just the light gray and the ocean gray. The deck blue would be for the horizontal surfaces like the decks, and all that we're going to see in the actual drawing will be the top of the torpedo tube shelter and the top of the torpedo tubes themselves. That's the only area of the ship where you'll actually see the deck blue, at least in a ShipBucket drawing. All right, so let's go back to Photoshop. So the first thing that I'm going to do is create the base layer of 5L. And the way that I'm going to do that is just by using Photoshop's All Layers functionality. This is a toggle that you can use with the Fill tool to fill in every color of the same color on that layer with another color. So what I'm going to first do is create a new layer, and I'll call it 5L overall. This will be just the basic base layer I'll do everything off of. I'm then going to create a selection of the upper part of the ship, and I'll show you this in just a second. Let me deselect the hull. The reason that I'm deselecting the hull is that I've actually put some anodes here on the rudder that I found in some of the plans, and for those colors I use the same gray color. I don't want them to be painted in camouflage whenever I fill everything in on the ship. Okay, so I've got this all selected. What I'm going to do now is then, using this palette here, you can see the top layer is ShipBucket Standard Gray. It's just the usual palette of colors that we use for all our drawings. The way that this tool works, since I have contiguous unchecked and I have all layers checked, whenever I fill this one ShipBucket Standard Gray color with the light gray color, Photoshop will find every pixel that has this color on the image and replace it with light gray. So doing that, let me show you. I can just fill, and now you can see that the superstructure, the basic gray color has been changed. So now I can do that with all the other colors, and we get the basic ship just with light gray instead of 5L. So let me toggle the visibility on the layer. You can see we get a very slight change in the gray tone. all of these camouflage colors that the U.S. Navy used were very, very slightly blue tinted. So even though it says ocean gray, haze gray, light gray, they were still some percentage blue, and that's important when rendering these drawings. Only in 1945 did they actually switch over to the basic no-tone gray, which was an actual gray and not a blue tinted gray. Okay, so we've now made our basic 5L base layer. This is good to go. What I'm going to do now is create another layer. This is going to be called 5.0 pattern. Since the pattern's comprised of the ocean gray 5.0. So let me first explain how this will work. So Photoshop has a really powerful fill tool and a really powerful selection tool. The way that I make the patterns is not by, for instance, taking the 5.0 and then like drawing a line and then filling. That would some people do it that way, but I don't have time to do that. So I've developed another way using selections, which actually works much quicker and it's a lot easier. So to first do this, I need to know I need to know what the actual pattern looks like. So for that, let me go back to my folder with my references, and I'm going to pull up this photo that I downloaded from the Model Warships forum. This is a pretty good side view of the Frank Knox at Rockland, Maine, to December 1944. Not a super high-res photo, but sharp enough that the lines of the camouflage are very, very easily visible, which is perfect for our purposes. So we can see now that the pattern makes a little curve here right at the hull number, and then up to the main deck, and then forward is all the ocean gray. So I'm going to move this to my other monitor. I don't think you'll be able to see it, but all right. Let me go back to my drawing, and what I'm going to basically do here. So this is actually the completed drawing that I finished a few days ago. This is what I'll be recreating. So I'm going to be using this as a guide just for the purposes of explaining, so I can kind of get this right without taking too much time checking back and forth. So I've zoomed in pretty far. I'm going to get the lasso tool, which is one of Photoshop's tools. I'm going to use polygonal lasso, which allows you to set points. You can kind of see how I'm making a pattern here. So what I'm going to do here is, let's first start drawing that curve. I'm going to kind of make it come like this, and then down, and it looks like it ends right below the end of the first gun turret. All right, let's drop that down a little bit, and then I will take it all the way to the bow and make a selection here. Okay, so now you can see that I've got this area selected. What I can basically do now is then, using the same method that I used to create the light gray, I can now fill the ocean gray on top of the light gray. And before I do that, though, I'm going to select this bow chalk right here, because that would also be painted in the ocean gray. But the rest of the stuff on the deck would probably end up being the 20B, but I'll get to that in a little bit. So let me zoom back out. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the light gray with the ocean gray. So let's start doing this. And I have hotkeys set up for all this stuff. So as you can see now, I've created a shaded bow. With 4 clicks of the mouse, I was able to fill everything almost instantly. Not a huge deal when you're working on the hull like this, but when you get into these really complicated areas of the superstructure like this, being able to just programmatically fill everything instantly is very, very nice. So I've made this selection, and it was kind of a rough and crude selection. What I need to do now is go back and consult the photos and make sure that I got the shape correct. So it looks to me like I haven't gotten the curve quite right. It looks like it curves a little bit more towards the stern right after the hull number. And it looks like I haven't quite gotten that curve down. So what I'm going to do now is start making some edits with the lasso tool here. So I'm going to curve this just a little bit, and then block out the selection, and then since we're zoomed in really far, what I can do, and we're only making a change to one of the shades that I can tell. What I'm going to do now is just use this shade and just fill it in. Okay, so it looks like we've probably gotten a little closer to approximating that shade, but it looks like it's still off a little bit. So let me modify this. I'm going to cut this back a little bit and using the delete key. So this is what's so useful about this. Let me zoom out here, and I'll deselect that. These are just layers. I haven't actually modified the underlying drawing at all. I can actually toggle the visibility, and the 5.0 layer is gone. This is actually pretty useful if you're making your own camouflage designs. You can experiment with how this looks. For instance, maybe I want to make a very, very light pattern with the 5L. I can then take my lasso tool and just make a weird selection like this. Let's bring it back over here, and then I can delete it, and then look at that. I have a funky wavy gray right there. Not very useful for making real drawings, but for the people that make what ifs or who make their own stuff, that's pretty useful. So okay, so back to making this curve correct. Let me zoom back in here. Let me look at my actual reference. It looks like there's more of a, I don't even know how to describe this, more of a square to this that I haven't quite gotten yet. So I'll take my eraser tool and I'll just kind of, oops, I'm on the wrong layer. That's very important. Let's get back onto 5.0 pattern. And I'll chop away at this to try to approximate that curve. And it looks like I'm getting pretty close here. I might actually need to drop this down a little bit. So let me do that with another lasso tool. Cut in, and away it goes. Okay, so if you look at it now, it's pretty close. It's not going to be perfect. That's going to be kind of hard with this. One area that I think could be improved is the proximity to the 7. Let me zoom in real far here. This is where the crappy resolution kind of comes back to bite you. But you can see the tip of the 7, the very top of the 7 is right on that line. So let me make sure that mine is as well. So let me chop this back a little bit, and then I'll recreate that angle at the top. There we go. Okay, looks pretty good. Looks close enough, I would say. Okay, so now it's time to do the rest of the ship. So let me look back at this. All right, so you can see that this pattern is fairly straightforward. We have the curve at the front, then we have a curve that starts between the two forward mounts, curves down and up towards the two 20mm mounts here, and then curves along the side of the superstructure. Looks like it ends halfway up the first funnel, and then curves back down and colors most of the amidships superstructure here, all of the torpedo tubes, and yeah, so this is pretty straightforward. It will be kind of tough to approximate this, curve, but we can get there. So let's start with that. So let me get my lasso tool back out, and I'm going to start making a selection again. So I'll start here. I'll kind of drop this down a little bit. Always remembering that we will get pretty close, but we won't be accurate to within inches because of the fact that it's a ship bucket drawing. So it looks like, just based on my reference that I have on my other monitor, it looks like our curve here stops about midway up the hull and then starts to raise back up and then meets the breakwater here almost perfectly before it then goes back up onto the breakwater and then comes back down. And it comes back down onto the hull itself about right here. Getting kind of close. And then it drops down to the water line about where this racked fire hose is up on the main deck under the bulwark. All right, so now I've created the selection here. Oop, I need to go the other way. Let's draw it back this way. So I'll be creating the big 5.0 section in the middle of the ship. So let's bring it back to about right here. Then I'll start back up and over to the 40mm tub. And let me ignore the secondary con. That's what this little area right here is, the shield around the secondary con. But because of the way the camouflage is applied, I don't think that was camouflage, but I'll come back to this in a second. Okay, then I'm going to go along the gun tub. Actually, let me select the gun itself, because I'm sure the gun was also painted. And then we're going to go up to the number 2 stack with all the stuff around it. I'm just going to make a quick selection here, and I'll come back and erase around this. I'll select around the DAK direction finder, get the searchlight as well. And then we're going to go across, getting the torpedo tube, and up to the funnel. Let me cut across the funnel here, and I'll show this on the picture in just a second, the actual photo of the ship. Then we're going to go to the superstructure here. We're getting towards the bridge. I'm going to select to the top of the flag bin right here, since I'm sure this was actually painted, even though the scheme drawing shows this just being cut. It shows it being cut almost like this, but I don't trust that just based on the photo evidence. So let's go to the top of the pilot house. We'll cut down towards the side light. Then we'll cut down again. Oops, went too far there. Okay, then we'll cut down by the 20 millimeter tubs that are abeam the bridge. Let's get those then. Oh, then it looks like there's a very small curvature here. Interesting. Which then comes up onto the gun turret, or the gun mount, excuse me. And we'll take that forward. And there's a small cut here intended to break up the ship's outline. And then we'll take it back to close the loop. Okay, so now we've got a selection made. Kind of exhausting doing that, but worth it, I think. Okay, so let's fill this. Let's fill this with a 5.0 using the same format I described earlier. We're on the correct layer. Okay, so just based on that, boom. Pattern has been filled in and we're good to go. So we're not quite done yet because when we made this selection, we also ended up filling the camouflage color over things like the whip antenna right here, this little outrigger for a radio antenna. Some of the rigging, we covered the searchlight lens, which isn't correct. The little sight on top of the torpedo tube, also not okay. But we'll come back to that. That'll come in the next little step that I do whenever I make the camouflage. So let's go back and look at the photo, and I'm sure there are some areas that need to be corrected. So, okay, let's look at the curvature here along the deck, or excuse me, along the hull. So it looks like it curves out a little bit, and I need to correct that. So let's do like that. There we go. All right, that looks a little better, I would say. And also, we need to smooth this out a little bit. So I'm taking the pencil tool and just doing that automatically, doing it manually, I should say. Okay, I don't like the effect that's given here by this black area. It doesn't look like, it doesn't really match the photo that I have here. So let me do this with the pencil tool. This is an area where the ability to kind of come to compromises with the pixel format is pretty important. So I'm going to fill all of that. And that will leave just enough to give the same effect as the photo itself. Okay. All right, looking good. So let's go to the stern here. All right, so it looks like it's a pretty straightforward thing from the stern back. There's one curve that starts under the aft torpedo tube, curves up to the deck, and then takes the entire hull with it, and the number 3 gun mount, and a little bit on the 0-1 level here on the main deck. So let's do that real quick. So I'd say it probably starts about maybe right here under the K guns, loops back a little bit. There we go. Okay. I'm also going to select the gun mount and all the stuff on the stern, except for the anodes here, which I actually selected around. All right, so let's fill those, and then we'll get to the next step, which is the cleanup process. Okay, so we've now roughly drawn the pattern. You've seen how I will use photos to go back and correct the pattern, so I'm not going to bother going into much further detail on that. Obviously, you understand that normally I would spend a lot more time creating this pattern because just drawing it this way can leave room for error. But for the purposes of brevity in this video, I don't want to go back through each area. So let me first talk about some of the cleanup that I'll do once I've then generated the pattern. So if you look at some of these areas, you can tell that they haven't actually been camouflaged. What I'm talking about right here is this white area under the gun. And this actually brings me to the topic of the white counter shading that these guys would do for the Measure 33 pattern, because they wanted to reduce shadows under overhang. So you can see it here as well on this 40 millimeter gun tub that's actually a sponson off of the 01 level along the main deck. You can see this white area right here. It's pretty obvious. And this is where white paint was actually applied under the gun tub to keep the shadows from being too dark. It's applied especially with the Measure 32 ships that use the black and the navy blue, the dark pattern ships, because it really could create some problems. You can also see it looks like there's a little bit of white, or possibly just the original 5L under the first torpedo tube. It also looks like this tub for this Mark 51 that directs the gun, the 40 millimeter here, is the light gray color. So we'll need to go back and correct that. It looks like we also have the white counter shading under this waist-mounted 40 millimeter. We have it under the overhang along the bulwark here. We also have it under the 20 millimeters. We also have it here, which I guess is the bridge wing. That's pretty big bridge wing. Another thing to note is that there's some evidence of the 5.0 paint on the front of mount 5.2, the second gun mount, and also on the back of mount 5.1, the first gun mount. So we'll need to go and add that. So let's go back to Photoshop. I'm going to go to the first gun mount. It looks like I got that on there, but I'm going to draw this. I'm going to make this a little more distinct. Let me just add to that thing. So earlier on, you saw me just filling the colors on the fly. Since this is a lot of different colors, I'm going to do the more practical way of using the palettes to color that in. Okay. Now looking back at it, it's been colored correctly. And it looks good enough. So I'll come back to this in a second. What I need to do now is add that other part of the 5.0 to the first gun mount. Now if we look at it, it looks like it starts about halfway up this little protrusion off the back of the gun. That's actually a shell deflector for the spent shells after they fire the gun. So it looks like it comes about halfway up the spent shell deflector all the way over to that side break in the gun. So let's go back to Photoshop, and I'll make a selection with the lasso tool starting halfway up that. I'm not going to go all the way over the dark gray that delineates the side of the gun, but I'm going to get right up next to it and then back. Once again, I'm going to be using my palettes to fill these in. There we go. Okay, looks good. It's good enough. All right, so that's the 5.0. Those are the 5.0 corrections that I needed to make. Let's go back to this. This is the Mark 51 tub that I had pointed out earlier. And as you can see from this, it looks to me like this is just an area that was chosen by the Bureau of Ships not to be camouflaged, just to break it up a little bit. So let's select this with my marquee tool and delete. And now we have a light gray gun tub on top of the ocean gray background. Okay, so I think we're doing pretty good here. Let's go to the deck blue. That's the next color that we need to apply. So I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to call it just 20B for deck blue. And let me make some very quick selections. As I had explained earlier, the deck blue is only going to be present on the torpedo tube top of the shelter on the number 2 torpedo mount. That was to protect the torpedoman from the blast of this gun. It's also going to be on top of the torpedo tubes. You can kind of see it here because the top's a little more black. Deck blue in these old black and white photographs looks like black. You can also see it on top of this one as well. Okay, so let's go back to Photoshop and we'll make that selection. So I'm just going to color this one little bit here. I'll also get that, and then I'll also do the top of the shelter. Let me go to the other torpedo tube, and I'll make this selection as well. Okay, so as you can see, based on the kind of rolling marquee, I've got these selected. Since I want to apply this evenly, and since I've got 2 colors currently sitting in my selection, the gray and the 5.0, excuse me, I want to first turn off the 5.0. I'm going to do that because this means that everything is now light gray, and I can apply the 20B evenly. So let's use my palette. I'll do deck blue onto light gray. And there we go. So now you can see the tops of my torpedo tubes are blue, the tops of the shelters are blue, and we are good to go. So let me turn on the 5.0 again, and you can see on the second torpedo tube that torpedo tube is colored with the 5.0, but it also has the 20B horizontal surface coloring on top of that. Okay, so that's good. The next thing that I'm going to do is the white counter shading, which was called 5U in the scheme. So you can see this is I actually don't have 5U as an official color on my palettes. This is something that because I haven't needed the color until recently, so I have this small chip for using that. So let's go back and look at our picture. So I've already pointed out the obvious areas where the 5U is very visible because it's on top of the ocean gray, which appears darker in the photographs. So you can see it under the 5-inch mount here. You can see it under the 40mm sponson tub right here. You can see it possibly under this torpedo tube, though I think that might be the gray showing through. But actually looking at it and comparing the tone of this with the known light gray on the hull, I think this might actually be white. So what I'll do is shade under the torpedo tubes with white. You can also see it under this area here. You can see it under the overhang along the bulwark. You can see it under the bridge wing. So one other area that I know that it was applied, but it's kind of hard to tell from this picture, is under this 20mm gun tub right here. The way that I know that is just based on the fact that where there should be a shadow, there's not a shadow. There's a small single pixel row of white. And this is something that you have to be on the lookout for, is, obviously the white is not going to stand out nearly as much from the light gray as it does from the ocean gray. So just something to keep in mind. Another interesting thing to note is that these areas of black smudge along the light gray are from ruptured fuel tanks. And one of the researchers on model warships mentioned that he had seen some communications going back and forth about this when the ship was running trials off of Rockland, Maine. So we won't draw that since ShipBucket doesn't show worn or damaged ships. So that feature is not important. But just something to be aware of so that you know what it is if you see it on other ships. Okay, so let's go apply the white to this. So same with the 20B, I want to turn off the dark gray that way, or sorry, I want to turn off the ocean gray, that way I can just apply it easily. I'm going to get out my lasso tool, and I'm just going to make a very quick, actually let me use, so recently I've been using the polygonal lasso tool, which you can make these nice anchor points with. For doing the counter shading, I'm going to use the normal lasso tool, which allows you to do a freehand drawing thing, which is kind of nice. So let's draw like a little squiggle along here. We obviously don't want that. Probably don't want this much of it. I'm gonna restrict it to about 2 pixels max. All right. Now this area is going to be kind of difficult because this sponsoned 40mm gun tub sits on a support strut which has a small king post for recovering torpedoes. And so this is going to be kind of difficult. For this, what I'm going to do is select just the areas that have the overhang shade. This is going to be interesting. There we go. And this is an area where you really need to know what you're looking at. It might not make sense to you guys, but it does make sense to me because I drew this part. So I know what I'm looking at. But if someone else is making this modification, this might be very difficult for them. Okay, so I've made that. Let me also make some selections under the torpedo tubes. Just very simple along here. Okay. And I'll make some selections under the overhang here and under here and here. Okay. Oh, and also under the bridge wing. Can I make that a little random if I can? Oh well. Okay, so that's now done with the 5U. So let me color in 5U based on this. Oh, I think I must have goofed. Oops, that's what I did. Okay, I was trying to color the standard gray instead of the 5L. So here we go again. Using the palettes. Okay, and now you can kind of tell I've got a little bit of counter shade under these overhangs. The effect looks kind of weird on top of the light gray, but let me turn on the 5.0, and now it makes a little bit more sense what you're looking at. Okay, I think that pretty much covers it for actually applying the color. So now the next part is to clean this up. So one of the main things that I like to do is for areas that don't have any of the actual drawing behind them, such as the rigging, these whip antennas, the railing that's not on top of the structure, like right here. I like to erase that back to the standard gray color. So the first thing that I'm going to do now let me explain this a little bit. So the why I think this makes sense is that if you were looking at this ship, the the railing would probably be pretty hard to see to begin with, but you would be able to see it against the superstructure, and especially if it was painted, you would see a color that looks dark like this against the superstructure versus a gray color against the sky, for instance, if that makes sense. It's kind of a hard concept to explain, but I think for the purposes of this style, it makes the most sense to keep the colors that are on top of white, keep those gray, keep the colors that are on top of the superstructure, keep those colored with the camouflage color. So basically the way that this works is that I've gone back to my 5.0 layer, and I've got out my eraser tool. And I'll just start erasing over the areas that need to be colored normally. So that's things like the gun sight on top of this 5-inch mount, and the piston that opens the gun captain's hatch. Let's see what else. I want to do the little staff here. That should not be colored in. And there are just a few areas that I need to get to before I can move any further. Obviously, the searchlight lens needs to be not painted. I'll also uncolor these little areas of the searchlight that are not on top of the black. Let's do this part of the rigging. I'll also do the little gun sight on top of the torpedo tube, control station. I'll do the wiring on the side of the 5-inch practice loading machine. There's more railing here. Okay, so what you can tell from this is that this would be a very tedious thing to do, to go and find every little area that needs to be erased. I'm not going to do that, and I don't expect anybody else to do that. People that use paint would have to do it, but I don't use paint. So what I'm going to do here is make use of Photoshop's very powerful selection tool to generate a selection, and then use that as a mask to delete the areas that are on top of the white. So what I'm going to do is use the load selection tool. I'm going to get out the marquee tool, and I'm going to hold the control button and select the layers that I want to add to my selection to create the mask. Add my Mark 51s, Mark 37. I'm not going to select railing because we want to delete the railing. So we want to first generate the selection of the drawing itself, and then once I've got that created, I will do Control-Shift-I in Photoshop, which is select inverse. So now I've selected everything that's not on top of the drawing. And let me go back to my 5.0 layer here. And I'm going to hit the delete button. And that automatically deletes everything that's not on top of the layer. I'm also going to do that on the 5L layer to get everything back to the standard chip bucket gray. So now when you look at this, you can tell that these areas here that were covered, these parts of the rigging that had the ocean gray on top of them are now back to being gray. And the general effect that you get from looking at this is a lot cleaner, a lot more organized. Something that I really like. Okay, so now that I've done that, what I want to do is just check the areas that I've looked at and make sure that everything is good to go. So just starting at the stern here, it looks like it's all pretty much okay. Actually, I remember seeing on this photo that we had some white counter shading under that aft 5-inch turret, or 5-inch mount, excuse me. So let's get out the 5U and make a little selection here. And what we're going to do, since we've got the 5.0 selected, or the 5.0 visible, I'm going to color this on top of the 5.0. There we go. Kind of a strange effect that it gives, but more or less accurate with what we have here. I don't know if I'll keep that or not, but yeah, but you can see how now I've finished the camouflage, and now what I need to do is go back and check everything. So something that I'm also realizing that I forgot is the way that this canvas dodger on front of this searchlight station, I missed this. This was a piece of canvas that was basically strapped onto the railing, the pipe railing along this little platform to provide the searchlight operators with a windshield. The Measure 33 scheme mandated that camouflage would be extended to canvas coverings, and they'd be dyed to match whatever they were on top of. So in this case, this is in the 5.0 area, so the canvas cover should be colored to match. So what I'll do, I'll go back to my 5.0 pattern, I'll select my canvas right here, and I'll just use the basic color to make that stand out. There we go. Okay, so this is looking pretty good now. Surprisingly, I can't believe I was able to recreate this on the fly. So yeah, I think I've pretty much covered everything. This is basically ready to be put into a template and posted for everybody to look at. So yeah, this will hopefully give you an idea of how powerful Photoshop is and other tools that use layering, and maybe give you some inspiration for how to put some camouflage onto your own ships, real or otherwise. So one thing that I would like to point out is just how flexible this can be. So let's look at this. I can now turn off any of these if I want to just have one of the colors. I can have 5.0 on top of ship bucket gray or nothing or whatever. It's a pretty powerful system. So this may not have been the best example because it only used 2 colors. Maybe next time I'll make one about Measure 32 with all the different blues and blacks and everything. But that'll have to come next time. But for now, I hope this gave you a good idea of how I create these camos. Probably diminish some of your respect for my skill because a lot of what I do is just kind of done automatically by Photoshop's fill and selection tool. But yeah, so hopefully you have a pretty good idea of how to do this in Photoshop or in other tools. I know that GIMP and Paint.net have pretty much the same feature set. So yeah, if you have any questions about this, please let me know, and I would love to answer any questions that people have. So thanks for watching, and I hope I kept it short enough. So thanks, guys. All right, take care.